In 1433, the most powerful maritime nation on Earth made a decision so strange that historians are still arguing about it 6 centuries later. It chose to forget the ocean existed. Not metaphorically. China possessed the largest fleet ever assembled in human history to that point. Ships so enormous that Columbus's entire flotilla could have been stored in the hold of a single Chinese vessel. China had mapped coastlines from Southeast Asia to East Africa. Chinese admirals had stood on shores no other civilization had reached by sea. And then, over the course of a few decades, China banned ocean-going voyages, let the fleet rot in harbors, made it illegal to build ships with more than 2 masts, and actually burned, the nautical charts and voyage records. The question isn't just what happened. The question is what kind of civilization destroys its own greatest achievement at the exact moment it could have used it to dominate the world. And the answer to that question explains not just ancient Chinese history, but modern Chinese behavior, the Belt and Road, the South China Sea disputes, the obsession with sovereignty. All of it traces back to a decision made in a palace in Nanjing 600 years ago. The story of Zheng He's treasure fleet is usually told as a tragedy of bureaucratic short-sightedness. Small-minded Confucian scholars strangling a visionary program out of jealousy and ideological stubbornness. And there's truth in that. But that framing misses something fundamental about how China understands power. This isn't a story about failure. It's a story about a civilization making a deliberate, rational choice based on what it believed civilization was for. Most people in the West, when they think about this period, are thinking about European expansion. 1492. Columbus. The Age of Discovery. But 2 generations before any European ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope, China was already operating a global maritime network that makes European exploration look modest by comparison. The Chinese were there first, and then they left. Understanding why they left, and what it cost them, and what they think about that cost today, is one of the most important historical questions you can ask, because that decision still shapes the world. We're going to examine 4 dimensions of this story. First, what China actually built, because the scale needs to be understood before the destruction can be comprehended. Second, what Zheng He actually did with that fleet across 7 extraordinary voyages. Third, the forces that conspired to kill the program and ultimately destroy the evidence it ever existed. And finally, what the long shadow of that decision means for how China thinks and acts today. To understand what China destroyed, you first need to understand what it built. The treasure fleet, Zheng He's Baochuan Armada, wasn't a navy in the European sense. European navies were instruments of war and trade, built lean and fast for long voyages with small crews that could survive on minimal supplies. China built something categorically different. The largest ships in the fleet, the so-called treasure ships, were reportedly around 400 feet long and 160 feet wide. To give you a reference point, the Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was roughly 85 feet long. A single Chinese treasure ship carried more displacement tonnage than Columbus's entire fleet. Some scholars debate the exact dimensions because the records were later destroyed, but even conservative estimates leave no doubt. These were the largest wooden vessels ever built in human history to that point, and likely for centuries afterward. The fleet that departed for the first voyage in 1405 consisted of approximately 317 ships and 28,000 men. That wasn't an expedition. That was a floating city. It included not just warships and treasure ships, but water tankers, supply vessels, horse transports, troop carriers, and specialized boats for navigating rivers. The organizational complexity alone, supplying, coordinating, and navigating this force across thousands of miles of open ocean, represents an administrative achievement that rivals anything in the ancient or medieval world. And the technology behind it was generations ahead of anything else sailing the world's oceans. Chinese shipbuilders had mastered the watertight bulkhead, compartmentalized hull sections that prevented a single breach from sinking an entire vessel. They used sophisticated magnetic compasses. They had detailed star charts for navigation. Their rudder designs were superior to European equivalents. In 1405, China didn't just have the world's greatest navy. China had the world's most advanced maritime technology, full stop. The question of why this mattered comes down to one word: leverage. A civilization that controls the sea lanes controls trade. A civilization that controls trade controls wealth. A civilization that controls wealth controls power. China understood this, and for extraordinary decades, It used that understanding to reshape the known world. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 voyages that touched 4 continents and reshaped the known world's understanding of who held power on the seas. The destinations tell the story: Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and ultimately the East African coast, reaching as far as modern-day Kenya and Tanzania. Everywhere the fleet arrived, it arrived as an undeniable statement of Chinese power and sophistication. But here's what makes Zheng He's voyages fascinating and historically unusual. They weren't primarily voyages of conquest. China wasn't building an empire in the European sense, it was building a system. The Yongle emperor who commissioned the voyages wanted tribute, not territory. He wanted foreign kings to acknowledge Chinese supremacy, send envoys to the imperial court, and participate in a China-centered world order. Zheng He's fleet didn't land and plant flags. It landed, displayed overwhelming force, conducted diplomacy, exchanged gifts, and left with delegations of foreign dignitaries who would travel back to Beijing to bow before the emperor. This distinction matters enormously. The Chinese model of power projection was centripetal, everything pulling toward China, orbiting China, acknowledging China. The European model that came later was centrifugal, power radiating outward, claiming land, extracting resources, building colonies. Both systems were about dominance. They just understood dominance differently. The voyages worked. Rulers from 30 or more nations sent tribute missions to the Yongle court. A king of Sri Lanka was brought to China, not as a prisoner exactly, but not entirely voluntarily either. African rulers sent exotic animals, giraffes most famously, that were presented at the imperial court as evidence of China's magnificent reach. For a generation, the Indian Ocean was, in all meaningful senses, a Chinese lake. And then Yongle died, and that changed everything. The fleet wasn't destroyed in battle. It was destroyed in committee rooms, by men with brushes, not swords. The forces that killed the program were political, ideological, and economic, and understanding them means understanding a fundamental tension that runs through Chinese civilization to this day. The Yongle emperor was an unusual figure. He'd seized the throne through civil war, essentially a usurper, and he used grand, expensive, legitimacy-claiming projects to consolidate his rule. The treasure fleet was one. The construction of the Forbidden City was another. The relocation of the capital to Beijing was a third. These weren't frivolous vanity projects. They were strategic investments in imperial authority, but they were enormously costly, and they made powerful enemies. The Confucian scholar bureaucrats who ran China's administrative apparatus had deep philosophical objections to what the fleet represented. In the Confucian worldview, the ideal society was agrarian, hierarchical, self-sufficient, and stable. Trade was seen as morally suspect. It arded cunning over virtue, disrupted social hierarchies, and introduced foreign influences that could corrupt Chinese civilization. Merchants ranked below farmers in the Confucian social order. A state policy that elevated maritime trade to a central priority was, to these officials, not just bad economics, it was civilizational disorder. There was also the question of the northern frontier. China's perennial existential threat wasn't from the sea. No meaningful naval power threatened China from the ocean. The threat was always the steppe, the Mongols, the Xiongnu before them, the Jurchen who would eventually become the Manchu. Every tale of silver spent building treasure ships was a tale not spent fortifying the Great Wall, maintaining cavalry, or paying the border garrisons. From a pure security standpoint, the Confucian bureaucrats had a legitimate argument. The ocean was expensive. The grasslands were dangerous. When the Yongle emperor's successors proved less personally committed to the voyages, the bureaucratic opposition moved decisively. Funding was cut, shipbuilding halted, the admiralty was deprioritized. Zheng He himself died on the 7th voyage in 1433, and no 8th voyage was ever commissioned. By mid-century, it was illegal to build ocean-going ships. Officials who proposed reviving the voyages were sometimes imprisoned. And then, in what remains one of history's most deliberate acts of institutional amnesia, the voyage records were destroyed. Some accounts say a senior official confiscated and burned them personally. Others suggest the destruction was more gradual, more bureaucratic. Either way, within a generation, China had systematically eliminated the documentary evidence of its own greatest maritime achievement. Why destroy the records? Because knowledge is political. If the records existed, someone could use them to argue for reviving the program. Destroying the records destroyed the argument. This is cold, clear institutional logic, not irrationality. China's bureaucracy understood that ideas need evidence to survive, and that eliminating evidence eliminates the idea. The consequences were immediate and cascading. Within decades of China withdrawing from the Indian Ocean, Portuguese ships appeared. By 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. By 1511, Portugal had captured Malacca, the same port cities where Chinese treasure ships had once anchored. The power vacuum China created by retreating from the ocean was filled with astonishing speed by civilizations that had been, just 50 years earlier, technologically and organizationally inferior. Here's the question that should sit with you. What would the world look like if China hadn't burned those ships? If the Yongle Emperor's successors had maintained and expanded the fleet, if Chinese merchants had followed Chinese admirals into the Indian Ocean trade networks, if China had claimed the East African coast as a sphere of influence, would the transatlantic slave trade have happened the way it did? Would European colonial empires have found the same footholds in Asia? Would the next 5 centuries of global history have unfolded differently? We can't know, but did we know this? The world that emerged after 1500, a world organized around European maritime dominance, European colonial extraction, European-defined modernity, was not inevitable. It became possible in part because China chose to leave. And China knows this. The memory of what was abandoned in 1433 sits in China's historical consciousness like a wound. Chinese historians and political leaders return to Zheng He repeatedly, not as a nostalgic curiosity, but as a symbol of what China was, what it lost, and what it intends to recover. Xi Jinping has invoked Zheng He explicitly when discussing the Belt and Road Initiative. The parallel is not subtle. Notice the pattern. 3 different forces drove the destruction of the fleet, ideological, strategic, and political, but they were all expressions of a single underlying logic. China has always had to choose between looking outward and consolidating inward. And every time that choice has become acute, the weight of Chinese civilization has pulled toward consolidation. This isn't weakness. This isn't small-mindedness. It's a coherent civilizational philosophy with roots 2,000 years deep. The Confucian vision of the ideal state is one that achieves stability through internal harmony, not external expansion. Expansion creates complexity. Complexity creates disorder. Disorder threatens civilization. Therefore, expansion, however glorious, is ultimately a destabilizing force to be controlled, not celebrated. The Roman Empire expanded until it couldn't and collapsed. The Mongol Empire expanded until it couldn't and fragmented. The British Empire expanded until it couldn't and retreated. China, across its long history, has generally chosen a different strategy: define the center, fortify the center, and let the periphery acknowledge the center's gravity. The treasure fleet was an anomaly, a moment when China experimented with outward projection. The Confucian bureaucrats who killed it weren't wrong that it was an anomaly. They were wrong about the cost of ending it. But here's what complicates any simple narrative of civilizational mistake. Within its own terms, China's strategy worked. The Ming dynasty lasted another 2 centuries after ending the voyages. China didn't collapse without the fleet. It remained the world's largest economy until the early 19th century. The inward turn wasn't catastrophic immediately. The catastrophe came slowly, in the form of European powers arriving with guns and treaties, and a China that had spent 4 centuries unlearning the ocean, finding itself unable to respond. That 4-century lag between decision and consequence is what makes the treasure fleet story so difficult and so instructive. Civilizations make choices whose costs aren't visible for generations. The Ming officials who destroyed Zheng He's records thought they were protecting China. They were, just not from the threat that eventually came. China gave up the ocean in 1433. Today, it's building the largest navy on Earth. The circle is almost complete. The South China Sea militarization, the Belt and Road ports from Pakistan to Kenya, the aircraft carrier program, the deep water submarine capability. These aren't isolated policy decisions. They're a civilization relearning what it once knew and chose to forget. Whether you see that as reassuring or alarming probably depends on where you sit in the world. But it can't be understood without understanding 1433. The treasure fleet was never really about trade or discovery or even tribute. It was about a civilization asking itself a question: what are we for? The Yongle Emperor answered one way. His successors answered another. 6 centuries later, Beijing is answering again, and this time, the ships aren't going to be burned. Which raises the question that actually matters. When a civilization this old, with this much historical memory, decides to return to something it once abandoned, does it make the same choices? Does it build the same kind of system? Or does it build something new? The answer to that question will define the next century of geopolitics more than any election, any treaty, or any war. What do you think? Is China's return to the ocean a restoration of something natural or something more complicated? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Leave it below.